Hello, welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. Bonjour et bienvenue à l'événement Scholars Hub. I'm Alison Gampel, Associate Director, Alumni Engagement at York University. Thank you for joining us today for Video Gaming for Good, Play in the Pandemic. Découvrez les bienfaits des jeux vidéo durant la pandémie. For today's lecture, there will be simultaneous interpretation in French, English, Spanish, and Mandarin, provided by Glendon students in the Masters in Conference Interpretation program. Click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choose the language of your preference. As we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're on and the current treaty holders. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We are very excited to partner with Glendon College to deliver this second part of a three-part series within the Scholars Hub series. This is a welcomed opportunity for collaboration and knowledge sharing. For any of you who are new to our Scholars Hub series, the series features discussions on a broad range of topics with engaging lectures from some of York's best minds. In 2022, you can look forward to topics including a discussion highlighting modern food ways and cultures, as well as an exciting presentation on the intersection of race and resistance in sports. Many of the topics are actually suggestions from you, our audience. Some of you provided ideas when you registered for the event or via our various social channels, so thank you. I'd like to give you an exciting York update. For those of you who have not visited the Glendon campus in a while, you may be pleasantly surprised to see some of the improvements and upgrades that have been made over the past 18 months. The Rose Garden has been revitalized along with the much needed upgrade of York Hall and the refurbishment of the historic Glendon Gate wall at the entrance of the campus. Residences have also been upgraded with the addition of the first fully accessible residence building, the Hilliard Residence. These changes and improvements were much needed, and the hope is that when students fully return to in-person classes, student life as a whole will be positively impacted. So that is just a wonderful update from our Glendon campus. Moving on, we'd like to get to know our audience a bit better with a quick poll before we begin the lecture. So today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? A poll should pop up on your screen. It's popped up. I'll give you a moment to respond. We'll see who the gamers are out there. If my kids were here, I'm sure they'd be responding. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's always helpful for us and for our speakers to have an idea about the knowledge you have coming into our sessions. If you need help at all with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write in your question. We've got a team ready to help you. And that same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speakers that they will answer during our Q&A period following the presentation. For anyone who's with us watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit any questions or comments in the comment section for the video, and the team will send them our way. Please do note that your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and to our staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. I'd now like to welcome the host of today's lecture, Glendon's principal, Marco Fiola. Principal Fiola started his mandate earlier this year in January, following an extensive national and international search. He holds a BA and an MA in translation from l'Université de Montréal, as well as a DEA in language sciences and a PhD in translation studies from Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle. He is a certified translator and terminologist with the Association of Translators and Interpreters of Ontario, and is a certified translator with the American Translators Association. Throughout his career, Principal Fiola has been a strong advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion, specifically through his award-winning research action work, publications, and community work on intercultural and interlinguistic communication. We are so pleased, Marco, that you can join us today as a host. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alison, for this warm welcome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this event, and if I may, I would even say, welcome to the virtual campus of York University. Specifically, welcome to Glendon today. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à cette deuxième participation du Collège Glendon à la série Scholars Hub que j'appellerais, si j'avais à la traduire, la tribune des universitaires ou la tribune des chercheurs. C'est une série qui se veut une série, une vitrine sur la recherche de pointe dans chacune des facultés de l'Université York. And by the way, if I may, I would like to thank the York Alumni Engagement Team for putting this series together and for organizing the logistics of this event. Les chercheurs, ou dans le cas de Glendon, pour cette série, nous avons des chercheuses. Les chercheuses qui participent au nom de Glendon à cette série ont été choisies en fonction de la pertinence de leurs intérêts de recherche. Cette semaine, nous sommes fiers de vous présenter la professeure Alison Harvey. Alison Harvey is Assistant Professor and Coordinator of the Communications Program at Glendon College here at York University. Her research and teaching focus on issues of inclusivity and accessibility in digital culture, with an emphasis on gender and labor in digital games. Her research interests revolve around game studies, internet studies, digital culture, feminist media studies, qualitative methods, political economy, and critical technology studies. Her research interests are numerous and rich. She's the author of Gender, Age, and Digital Games in the Domestic Context, published in 2015 with Routledge, as well as Feminist Media Studies, published in 2019. Elle a également publié dans plusieurs revues scientifiques, notamment New Media and Society, Games and Culture, International Journal of Cultural Studies, Feminist Media Studies, Information, Communication and Society, Social Media and Society, et finalement, Studies in Social Justice. Comme vous voyez, elle est très prolifique en recherche et en publication. She holds a BA and an MA from Concordia University in Montreal, as well as a PhD from York University. She completed a postdoctorate at the University of Toronto prior to joining Glendon in 2020. Today, she's inviting us into the fascinating world of gaming, specifically video gaming, in her talk titled Video Gaming for Good, Play in the Pandemic, ou Découvrez les bienfaits des jeux vidéo durant la pandémie. Alors, je vous invite à accueillir chaleureusement la professeure Harvey. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marco. So, you can see my slides now. I want to say good afternoon and thank you so much for coming today to this Scholars Hub talk. Today, I'm going to be talking about video games and why the medium has played such an important role, especially during the pandemic for many people. The reality is, since 2005, when I started studying video games, a lot of people have kind of come up to me expressing concerns about them, especially parents and teachers. And a lot of the concerns revolve around what is the attraction to video games, and oftentimes around this line of addiction to screen-based play. What I hope that you're going to take away from my talk today is that there's actually a lot of reasons to see video games as something that's rewarding and maybe even a beneficial activity. In fact, I'm going to argue that video game play has many potentially positive outcomes that have been rather potently underlined during these intermittent lockdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic throughout 2020 and 2021. But as I'm going to conclude, there are some reasons for us to be concerned. They're just not the typical fears that are showcased in the news media about video games. There's a lot of things going on my screen, sorry. Hopefully now you can see slide 2. So we know that the pandemic's been really hard on several industries, arts and entertainment, hospitality, but video games are not one of those sectors that have been challenged. According to the market research firm Newzoo, games in 2020 boasted global revenues of about $174.9 billion, which is a growth of 19.6% from previous years, and also $15.6 billion higher than the previous forecast that was made in the earliest days of the pandemic. In 2021, they forecasted revenues of $175.8 billion, and by the end of this year, there will be about 2.9 billion gamers worldwide. Now, the US and China play a large role in those ever-increasing sales, but Canada is a large consumer of games as well. According to the NPD report, across 2020, and in particular in the latter part of the year, double-digit percentage gains were recorded for sales in game software, hardware, and accessories. And that's because there's something very attractive about gaming during the pandemic, which I'm going to elaborate on in just a moment. According to the Essential Facts 2020 report, which is produced by the Entertainment Software Association of Canada, or ESAC, video games are a pervasive and popular leisure activity in Canada. Around 23 million Canadians play video games, amounting to 61% of the population between 18 and 65, and 89% of kids and teens between 6 and 17. You can see here on the screen some stats about the average player that they tend to surprise people that come from outside of my field of research. So there's some commonly circulated stereotypes about who the gamer is, but in fact, the average age of the Canadian game player is 34 years of age, and that person is just as likely to be male as female. If you think that you're not one of the 61% of people that are indicated here, I'd like you to consider their definition of the player. So for them, it would be anyone who's played any video game in the past 4 weeks. Type of game, amount of time invested, or frequency of play don't matter. So in their study methodology, it would count the dedicated daily player of Fortnite and also the occasional player of a matching game on the iPhone. In their 2020 study, the ESAC paid some specific attention to the role of gaming in the pandemic. According to their president and CEO, Jason Hilchey, this is a quote, "Canadians are turning to video games even more now as a safe way to connect with their friends and family and escape what can seem like a never-ending cycle of bad news." More prosaically, it turns out that when people have to engage in leisure at home and in a manner that is physically distanced, we turn to our screens, right? Netflix, streaming services, social media and online communication tools, and of course, video games. According to the 2021 Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, the online video market increased by 25% from 2.7 billion to 3.2 billion. As the ESAC's research shows, of the 23 million Canadians who already play video games, 58% of adult gamers and 80% of teen gamers reported playing even more during the pandemic. Even larger proportions of those players said that gaming while needing to stay home contributed to better mental health. As you can see from the stats here on the screen, a lot of this play is familial play, right? 69% of parents with children aged 6 to 12 are playing with them. 60% of parents with teenagers aged 13 to 17 are playing with them. So the ESAC captures gameplay, but they also capture practices of streaming or viewing the play of games online, including a growing industry that's called esports. You can see here that these viewing practices have also increased during the pandemic. And it's important to note that those activities are not like passive. In fact, streamers are often focused on engaging their audiences. And really, we have to think about these as active communities of viewers that spring up around specialized channels on YouTube and Twitch. Overall, why I want to showcase this research is because those who participated in the study reported that, quote, they view gaming as an important mainstream form of entertainment that supports social connectivity, a sense of well-being, and mental health. But of course, those who participate in the surveys of the ESAC are just a subset of the population, and their viewpoints might not reflect the 15 million other people in Canada who are not identifying as gamers here. As I mentioned, I've been researching games for about 16 years, and a lot of the time I hear these kind of two dominant lines of concern coming around video games. So the most enduring is that of the video game violence argument. There's these concerns that video games are going to desensitize children to violence and lead to more aggressive behaviors. And alongside that kind of media panic, I've also heard a lot of worries about whether gaming is addictive, which reflects a great deal of media attention on the topic of dysfunctional or dependent patterns of engagement with games. This was intensified by the controversial declaration of the World Health Organization in 2019 of the existence of something called a gaming disorder. So given over 20 years of bad press about games along these lines, it's not surprising that gameplay, especially that of children, can be seen as something to worry about. For that reason, increasing amounts of play during the pandemic might seem like nothing to celebrate. But what's interesting is that media attention on video game violence and their effects and also addiction doesn't reflect the science about video games at all. So there's been years and years and years of funded research that tries to find a causal relationship between the play of video games and violent actions like mass shootings. But there's actually been no evidence at all to suggest any clear connection between these things. So the psychology professor, Chris Ferguson, who's quoted here on the screen, has done extensive research on his own field's interventions into games and other technologies. And what he's found is that there's been an inability to replicate any findings in this area. In fact, he conducted a meta-analysis over 100 studies of the subject, and he found, and this is a quote, "Violent video games have little impact on kids' aggression, mood, helping behavior, or grades." In fact, the growth in the popularity of violent video games actually tends to correlate with large declines in youth violence rather than substantive increases. He's equally critical of the so-called findings related to addiction. So he notes that these comparisons are made between video game play and drug taking, which for him is just example of moral panic rather than science. He doesn't disagree that gaming activates the pleasure centers of our brain. And he doesn't disagree that activities that do that, like food, sex, and exercise, can be overdone by some people. But he says there's insufficient data to make even a diagnosis of addiction through gameplay. So put simply, studies based on things like brain imaging and dopamine release during play have tended to be oversimplified in the media, decontextualized from their studies' limitations, and really just kind of promoted with relish in largely quite conservative political quarters. So there are several reasons to challenge these framings of gameplay, including that directing our attention to any media or technology as the root of serious problems tends to distract from their societal, economic, political, and cultural basis. For those who work in and with games, including researchers and also their creators, decades of negative media attention have done an injustice to the role of these creative forms in our everyday lives, including what can be seen as beneficial side effects of the pleasure of play. So consider, for instance, the findings from this 2020 study out of the University of Oxford, which was based on both industry data combined with player surveys on motivation and well-being. These researchers reported that, quote, experiences of competence and social connection with others through play may contribute to people's well-being. Indeed, those who derived enjoyment from playing were most likely to report experiencing positive well-being. So put simply, rather than being bad for one's health and needing to be limited, gameplay was shown to relate positively with mental health in this study. But there's something I do want to flag up here, which is that they found that, this is another quote, a player's subjective experience during play might be a bigger factor for well-being than mere playtime. And this is really significant for a reason that I'm going to come to towards the conclusions of this talk. Comme on parle de suggère, l'un des principaux avantages des jeux vidéo est le fait que la plupart des jeux sont effectués avec d'autres. Cela peut être dans le cadre d'un lien familial ou dans des équipes de joueurs de différents endroits du monde. Comme le note ce reportage de la BBC, il y a un lien communautaire de l'autre côté d'un écran. Ces connexions sont rendues possibles par les médias sociaux et la nature de plus en plus en ligne de jeu, même sur console. Autrefois, la blague était que les gens peuvent se marier avec la personne qu'ils rencontraient dans Second Life. Mais pour les jeunes d'aujourd'hui, les amitiés et les relations amoureuses en ligne font partie de la vie quotidienne. Pendant la pandémie, les jeux numériques sont également devenus un moyen de nous donner du contenu pour nos discussions sur Zoom. Pendant le confinement de Noël dernier, j'ai joué à des jeux Jackbox Party avec ma famille à Montréal et Victoria. L'importance de l'élément social de jeu est mise en évidence dans les jeux qui étaient populaires pendant la pandémie. Cela inclut Among Us, le jeu multijoueur sur le sabotage dans l'espace. Il comprend également le jeu populaire Animal Crossing, New Horizons, où les joueurs naviguent dans un monde mignon d'animaux et s'occupent de leur maison et de leur jardin. Cela peut être nouveau pour certaines personnes pendant la pandémie, mais la recherche sur les jeux montre que la connexion sociale des jeux a toujours été une caractéristique centrale de cette forme de média. Cela explique la popularité de jeux comme World of Warcraft et EverQuest dans les années 2000 et Fortnite et Roblox plus récemment. Cela explique également la popularité du streaming de jeux. Les gens acquièrent un sentiment d'appartenance communautaire et sociale en regardant les joueurs. À une époque où nous ne pouvions pas aller à des fêtes, à des mariages ou voyager pour voir de nouveaux endroits, ils nous ont donné des espaces virtuels pour simuler cela. Ironiquement, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé a lancé la hashtag Play Apart Together, encourageant les jeux sociaux pendant la pandémie. Dans l'ensemble, les jeux offrent un espace pour l'établissement de relations, la connexion et la communauté. Ceci est lié aux avantages sociaux et psychologiques. Le jeu est également associé à des compétences liées à la résolution de problèmes. En effet, la majorité du temps passé à jouer à des jeux consiste à échouer, à apprendre à se corriger par la suite et à accomplir des tâches difficiles. Les chercheurs de l'Institut Max Planck pour le développement humain révèlent que jouer à des jeux augmente la taille de cerveau, affine les compétences acquises et améliore l'orientation spatiale, l'organisation de l'information et les habiletés motrices. Ce n'est pas mon domaine de spécialité, donc je ne veux pas exagérer cette conclusion, mais je pense qu'il est important de souligner ici que ces études de recherche reçoivent beaucoup moins d'attention médiatisée. C'est surprenant pour moi car en 2010, la conceptrice de jeux américaine Jane McGonigal a publié son livre influent « Reality is Broken, Why Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World ». Et je le recommanderais à toute personne intéressée à en savoir plus sur les avantages cognitifs du jeu. Je ne suggère pas que la forme de jeu vidéo a un impact uniformément positif sur le monde, mais qu'il y a des éléments bénéfiques négligés qui méritent d'être pris en compte. Une autre facette de ceci est la relation entre les jeux et la créativité. Une étude de 2019 de l'Iowa State University a lié les jeux à une créativité améliorée. Mais pour moi, c'est un argument qui est très évident. Les jeux vidéo sont un élément clé de la culture participative contemporaine. Cela fait référence à la façon dont nos technologies de communication en réseau offrent des faibles barrières à l'entrée et à l'accès aux utiles pour jouer, créer et partager les créations qui en résultent. Dans les jeux, il existe une longue histoire de telles pratiques. Les développeurs de jeux ont réagi en publiant des jeux comme Little Big Planet et Minecraft, qui reposent sur la créativité des joueurs. Minecraft existe depuis 10 ans. Il n'y a pas de statistiques fiables sur le nombre de cartes, de niveaux ou des mondes développés par les joueurs, mais c'est en raison de son accessibilité et de ses possibilités presque illimitées que le jeu a toujours un attrait. In terms of benefits, I also want to take a moment to just talk about pleasure. So there can be this catharsis to running around a space station shooting at aliens. And there can be a rush that comes from defeating a challenging quest in a competitive game. And also there can be a reprieve from being immersed in a fantastic virtual world. But these are not the only joys and affects of games. There are also many more digital play experiences than we tend to focus on when we talk about competitive and violent video games. In 2021, a lot of attention was paid to the growing genre of something called wholesome games. So titles that offer cozy, slow, cute, or overall quite pleasant experiences in play. So just like every other creative form, the aesthetics and mechanics of games can support more than one genre, more than one form of storytelling. At the Major Games event of 2021, E3, there was a showcase of 75 such wholesome games, including the one you see pictured here, Paparazzi, where the only goal of the game is for you to take pictures of dogs. Given the popularity of games like Animal Crossing that I mentioned earlier, it's not a surprise that the industry behind games is paying attention to other kinds of play experiences and their potential to bring in new audiences of players. So far I've taken some time to outline the deficits of the video game violence discourse and the addiction discourse, and highlighted some benefits related to social connection, cognitive abilities, well-being, creativity, and pleasure. But what I want to do with my time remaining is to note that there are some things that we should be alert to when it comes to games, particularly if you're thinking about child players. So the tools and support for creativity that I mentioned that are built into games can be really exciting, but there's a dark side to the design of these games. So let's take the very, very popular platform Roblox. Research by the People Make Games team notes that Roblox has 200 million users a month. It's valued at $45 billion, and the core of their user base is kids aged 9 to 15. So Roblox calls itself a creative platform rather than a game, and they say what they host are experiences, not games. In reality, they do. They host a range of games that are made by the people who use it. Now, those people are able to earn money from the games that they make on the Roblox platform. But what is important to note is that the cut from their revenues is much less than the industry standard. So developers make 70% of their profits on Steam, 88% on Epic Games Store. On Roblox, you can earn 24.5%. And this potential payout is reduced by the fact that if you want to cash out your earnings, you have to pay a $5 a month subscription fee. You also have to pay a conversion fee. That means that if you've earned $1,000, it'll only pay out about $350. Given the fact that it's children that's making most of the content on Roblox, some critics have raised concerns that this is exploitation of young people, especially since they're kind of promoting this idea of the entrepreneurial game designer. And this is especially egregious given that if you want to sell your games, you have to pay to raise the visibility on Roblox through advertising. So as this indicates, I think it's really important to pay attention to game mechanics and their associated policy documents, so terms of use, terms of service, and end user license agreements. And these govern how user data and user content development is treated, as well as privacy. Another area of concern that I'd like to flag up here is this turn to something in the profit model of online games that's called loot boxes. So this gets at how increasingly there's this tendency to turn towards small transactions or microtransactions, like the payment of small amounts of money in games that you've already paid for. Players typically hate these design functions. They are hugely profitable for game companies. The reason why I think they're of concern and why other people think they're of concern is because some of these microtransactions are based on chance. So players are given the option to buy something that may or may not be of value. These like loot boxes, they're stylized as boxes or crates, as you can see here. You buy them not knowing what they contain. So the promise is that they might contain some sort of rare character or specialized equipment, but just as likely they might contain virtual trash, something very common in the game. You pay 99 cents for these, $5, $10. If this reminds you of a slot machine, you're not alone. In 2018, many countries debated whether games that contain loot boxes like Call of Duty are actually gambling and whether therefore they should be made available to children. Belgium made the news because they did in fact deem these to be illegal. But in other countries like the US and UK, their status is much less clear, even though these games can be played by children, and even though they take a quite predatory approach in their appeals, right? You're playing a competitive game and they suggest you can gain an advantage if you just invest a small amount of money. Finally, I want to flag up a pretty significant consideration, especially when it comes to the social belonging and feelings of well-being that can be derived from play. Playing with other people can be deeply pleasurable and satisfying, but the lack of moderation and regulation of online spaces means that less rewarding encounters are also possible. The Anti-Defamation League notes that in addition to growing rates of harassment, it's specifically women and Black and Asian American players that are targeted. Furthermore, research out of the Southern Poverty Law Center notes that online games have become a site of recruitment for extremist hate groups, enabling them in particular to access and target children. That means that the 90% of teens that use gaming platforms may be being exposed to racist, misogynistic, homophobic, and ableist slurs and attacks, as well as anti-Semitic vitriol and neo-Nazi propaganda. So I want to flag up these areas of concern to provide some balance to this discussion of whether video gaming is good or video gaming is bad. There's been a tendency to take this kind of approach to games, but also to many communication media and technology. What my field of communication studies suggests is that we have to take a more nuanced approach to considering possible benefits alongside very real problems. The reality is games are ubiquitous, mainstream, everyday leisure activity, particularly for young children, or young people, and they're part of our everyday culture now. Their increased play during the pandemic has shown that they perform a major role in our lives today. But to maximize the beneficial elements of this social, creative, participatory, and engaging media form, we have to pay attention less to what they simulate and more so to what they enable. What do they facilitate? And what do they require from their players, including but not limited to kids and teens? We've seen overall decontextualized screenshots and videos of violent games that create one idea of what games are and do. But what I suggest is that we have to look at other sources of information to assess and evaluate games. So as mentioned, that includes not very sexy, but governance documents that dictate how game companies can profit from their user bases. We also need to pay critical attention to the industry itself. Even though games as an entertainment form have been around for 40 years, the sector often describes itself as young. And then they use that to justify a range of ills like predatory loot boxes, exploitative approaches to user creativity, and toxic online gaming environments. And finally, I would say we need to consider actual player practices, what people do with games and where they fit into our lives. Taking a broad and balanced view of the media we engage with, games, but also others, puts us in a better position to address their limitations and challenges, and also to harness their benefits and their opportunities. So I just want to finish by thanking you for coming and listening today. And I also want to thank the team that made this event possible, including our wonderful team of conference interpreters. I'm looking forward to our Q&A, but I've also just included here my contact information in case you'd like to check further later. That's it.
That's it. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What an information-packed presentation you gave us. A brilliant overview of your research and of your field of interest. We have a number of questions already lined up coming from the audience, but I do have my first. I think I'll take. It's my prerogative. I can ask you one question. What brought what? How did you become interested in this field of research? And this is coming from a guy who, talk about video games. I could name Pac-Man, Pong, and Tetris. I think that's how far back my experience of video games goes to. But what brought you to this field of research in particular? What piqued your interest?
When I started game studies, I think a lot of people were in the same position you were, right? There wasn't a whole lot of interest in the field critically, and there wasn't that much attention to them. It was pretty subcultural around 2005. And that's what interested me in them, because I was thinking, when I was a kid, I liked to play games. I played a lot of Super Mario, and it kind of just fell away from me as a leisure activity. But then when I looked around, it was still the kind of boys in my life that it was part of their leisure activity. So I was interested in the gender dynamic of games at that time. But then everything changed. Between, in 2007, they released the Nintendo Wii. There became a real interest, I think, in cultivating new audiences of players. So I was interested in the gender dynamics of play at the time, but where it really transformed for me was looking at the role of games kind of as an industry in our creative industries. Yeah. Many people say that games have kind of acted as like a canary in the coal mine, or like a really good source of information about future trends and how work is organized, how creative production is organized, the profit model of cultural production. So for me, in a lot of ways, games are about games. I think they're a really interesting creative form that do interesting things around, ethical decision-making, for instance, and providing interactive experiences that are social. But I'm also just really interested in the context that they're made in, and the way that that industry positions what they're doing, the way that, even though it's a mainstream industry, it still has one of the worst gender breakdowns of who works in that industry, despite the fact that you saw 50% of players are male and female. So I'm really interested in looking at games as kind of a way of understanding what are the trends to come in tech and creative and media work in the future. Yeah.
Good. Excellent. We do have questions. I do want to take the time to go to our audience for questions. Do you, one is quite specific, do you happen to know if participation in video games prolong life expectancy in human longevity, or are we just simply happier?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I wonder if any research has been done on it. I'm sorry to say, Will, that I'm like a cultural studies communication scholar, so I don't have like really in-depth insight into the more biological questions.
Right.
I think there is a growing area of research on use of games by elderly people. So I think like if you're interested in that, that is like a wide field to get into, with a lot of relevance with the aging population.
Fantastic. And brain activity and what it does to to keep your brain functions alive. Second question is quite specific. So how does Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding and the idea of anonymous contributions to others' games fit into your findings on creating connections through gaming during the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Noah. I think this talk focused on like positive kinds of things that you can say about games, but in equal measure, there are critical things to say. I wonder if, like, when I was talking about the findings of the Anti-Defamation League, you kind of got a sense of that. There can be very positive social interactions that happen as a result of gaming, but there is a lot of evidence, research, and even industry studies that show extremely antisocial kinds of possibilities as well. And to me, this is why it's really important to consider what are the ways that the industry is structuring play, because they can do more to ensure that the social connections that we are forming there are positive. there has been a real hands-off kind of approach to moderating player speech and player behavior. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that anonymity plays a role in that, which is not to say that I think that everybody needs to be identifiable everywhere they are online. That would inhibit some of the pleasures, but there's ways for the game to know if there's, like, for instance, repeat offenders, if someone is using that anonymous element to harass other people. So I would say you made a really good point there in indicating that as much as they enable social connection, they can also enable antisocial behavior too.
Right, right. And a little bit the same in the same vein. You mentioned something about gender, about discrimination and anti-Semitism and and homophobia. But have you done studies on games that seem to promote negative gender stereotypes, specific games that are particularly notorious for this kind of promoting this kind of behavior or frame of thinking?
Yeah, Peter, this is possibly the best researched part of games. The fact that historically representation in games has been extremely stereotypical when it comes to gender, but also race, and almost like negligible when it comes to other lived realities of people. There's this kind of meme that goes around of like gamer protagonist bingo, where it's just a large quadrant of pictures of kind of white, brown-haired characters in games. So there's been a lot of attention paid to this recently. And if this talk was an hour, I would have talked about this because, games as participatory culture is partly also about gamers responding to game developers through social media. There's like a lot of back and forth between communities of players and game developers. And you can probably see in the last couple of years, there have been some shifts to what players look like. So, what characters look like in games. And I guess the big example of that is, I'm totally blanking on the name now. Oh no. It's Fortnite. Because in Fortnite, there is like a gamut of characters. They've really paid a lot of attention to diversity in their character development. So there is more attention being paid to that. But like historically, this has been the reason why people assume that gamers are a very narrow group of people, because it looks like that's who they're appealing to, right? The fact that people played a diversity of games, despite the fact that they tend to be narrowly marketed and narrowly promoted and narrowly designed for a small group of people, is almost a contradiction of the thing. And who knows what it would be like if there was a lot more kind of diversity. I'm hoping we'll see that coming up.
Very interesting. One more question, maybe. What games would you recommend to someone who is new to gaming, like me? I'm sort of new to gaming. I mean, it's been so long. What would you, either a game that you can play on your own by yourself, or I'm quite intrigued now by this idea of gaming, to join a group of people to play the same game together. Yeah.
It's a hard question to answer, because can you imagine if you asked me to recommend a movie, right? Like it depends on what kind of experience. What genre do you like? Like what kind of experience are you looking for? I think if you're looking for that social element, I really enjoyed playing Jackbox Party over Christmas, because that's something that's really easy for people to pick up. It's very accessible. Just one person needs to own it. And that's like, it's like the familiar mechanics of games we already know. So it's very easy for people to get on board with it. I'm really into puzzle-based games that tell a story through the puzzle. So I've recently been playing a game called Unpacking, which this is not going to sound fun, but you're just moving someone through someone's life, unpacking their stuff into different contexts. But it tells a story from being a child to like growing up through to having a relationship. It's environmental storytelling, so that's really nice. Or Untitled Goose Party. Wait, I'm forgetting the name of that one too now. If you search Untitled Goose, you'll come up with a hilarious game that is a puzzle game about a really naughty goose trying to steal things from a village. Untitled Goose Game, yeah.
That sounds fascinating. They're good suggestions for, you never know, during the holidays, if you're going to spend much of your time, on your own, you may, surf and look for those kinds of games. Now, another very specific question: if you were to remove players who use shape sorter, bubble popper type of phone games, which are traditionally female populated, if you were to remove those from the group who play games, what's your guesstimate as to male-female ratio of players? Is there would the 50-50 proportion still be the same?
The research shows that there are definitely gendered preferences in terms of genres and I guess devices that you would play on. But I think what's kind of interesting is that like the women over the age of 36 have been the fastest growing market for games for the last 10 years. And we still think of them as like not the core, but the core is like the people who play on consoles, the people who are playing violent games. But in some ways, my question would be, why wouldn't we just take out the people who are playing on consoles and only count those people who are playing games on their phone? Because they've become more significant in terms of like where the game industry is making its money than what we typically kind of associate with gaming. I think it's like a weird shift that a lot of people have to let go in terms of thinking like what is real gaming and what is like this other kind of gaming. Right. I think it's really important that the ESAC just captures all of that as gaming, because it is. It's just different kinds of devices. But to your point, Jan, is that if you look at sports games tend to have much lower percentages of female players versus male players, and matching games tend to have higher percentages of female players over male players. But then there's like a huge swath of games in the middle that is like really just like 40, 60, 70, 30. So it's not like men play on the console, women play on the phone, and you can separate that out. It's a bit messier than that now.
Yeah, interesting. On va passer en français, si tu veux bien. Hein?
Oui.
Donc, les jeux vidéo ont beaucoup changé. J'en suis la preuve. Les jeux vidéo ont beaucoup changé depuis que je suis jeune, hein, depuis mon jeune âge. Quels sont, selon toi, les prochains développements les plus excitants? Qu'est-ce qui s'en vient? Qu'est-ce que tu vois comme nouvelle tendance dans la production, dans le genre, dans le format des jeux vidéo de l'avenir? Qu'est-ce qui s'en vient et qu'est-ce qui est le plus excitant pour toi?
Ouais, j'ai deux réponses pour ça, parce qu'il y a quelque chose d'excitant et quelque chose un petit peu, pour moi, épeurant. Pour moi, je pense que ce qui est excitant est que, parce qu'il y a des plus grands nombres de personnes de divers âges, de divers genres qui jouent des jeux, il y a beaucoup plus d'expérimentation de jeux qui arrivent. Comme j'ai dit, unpacking, par exemple. Il y a beaucoup plus de producteurs et conceptrices de jeux qui sont independent. Alors, ils font des jeux qui sont un petit peu différents que ceux qu'on voit de Ubisoft ou de Electronic Arts. Alors, pour moi, c'est excitant qu'il y a beaucoup plus de personnes qui jouent maintenant. Et alors, il y a beaucoup plus de diversité de jeux. Mais ce qui est effarant pour moi, que je fais une étude cet été sur c'est quoi l'avenir de l'industrie. Et pour plusieurs des personnes dans l'industrie des jeux, ils ont dit à moi le metaverse. Alors, cette idée qu'on peut avoir comme une vie qui est entièrement numérique, on peut faire toutes nos activités dans ce monde tout à fait virtuel. Et pour moi, c'est un petit peu un problème, ça, parce qu'il n'y a pas plusieurs des personnes qui ont accès à ce monde. Et pour moi, la motivation pour faire quelque chose comme ça est vraiment pour faire plus d'argent. C'est pas pour les personnes qui jouent des jeux qui veulent quelque chose comme ça.
Oui, c'est ça. On est des êtres foncièrement sociaux. Hein? On aime bien les contacts. On aime bien se rencontrer, on aime bien aller manger au restaurant quand on en a l'occasion. Donc, je pense qu'il y a, comme tu le dis, il y a un rôle pour les jeux, pour le divertissement, peut-être même pour l'évasion. Hein? Tout à l'heure, tu disais qu'il y avait des segments de la population qui cherchaient de plus en plus à utiliser ces jeux-là un peu pour s'évader, pour se changer du quotidien qui est un peu répétitif avec la pandémie. Donc, faire quelque chose de différent, mais on est tellement content quand on rencontre les gens en chair et en os aussi que un ne peut pas remplacer l'autre.
Ouais.
J'ai remarqué que en éducation, hein, dans le domaine de l'éducation, on parle de plus en plus de l'introduction de jeux dans les salles de classe à des fins pédagogiques, à des fins d'enseignement. Par le jeu, on peut faire apprendre des choses, certaines choses, certains contenus, certains principes, certaines vertus, si tu veux, aux jeunes. Qu'est-ce que tu penses? Est-ce que tu penses que c'est une bonne chose d'utiliser les jeux dans les salles de classe, dans un âge, pour les jeunes, chez les jeunes enfants surtout?
Oui, et je pense qu'il y a quelques questions qui sont relevantes à ça, comme est-ce qu'il y a trop de temps qu'on passe sur les jeux, même pour les raisons pédagogiques?
Oui.
Et pour moi, il y a encore deux réponses à ça, parce que les jeux ont quelque chose de très spécial, parce qu'ils peuvent comme faire une motivation, qu'ils nous donnent il y a des objectifs, il y a des buts, on peut célébrer qu'on a, you know, made an achievement there. Mais le problème avec les jeux dans les affaires pédagogiques est que des fois, les jeux sont pas vraiment faits très bien. Et ça a le problème que c'est possible qu'ils ne font pas que qu'on veut avec ça. C'est pas vraiment like I'm going to answer in English. I'm so sorry. I'm just getting tired now. That the design of the game doesn't align with our pedagogical or our learning outcomes, right? So we have to be careful. You cannot just paste a game on top of a learning objective.
Correct.
Those games that people are interested in are very well designed, right? Like they're made by teams of thousands of people. A lot of time, educational games are not made like that.
Right.
And it's possible that it's not going to have the goal that the outcome that you're looking for. They have to be used carefully. And to answer the question, if someone said, is there such thing as too much screen time? I think when we've all been learning online, you know, gamifying that is not going to make a big difference. You know, like
no.
Young people can tell the difference between a game for fun and a game for learning math.
Yeah. And we try to make Zooming more fun, but it is what it is. It's pretty dry. Merci beaucoup, Alison. C'est tout le temps que nous avons. Malheureusement, on aurait pu parler encore pendant des heures et ça aurait été tout aussi intéressant, tout aussi fascinant. Merci beaucoup de nous avoir donné ce temps-là. Merci, je te félicite pour tes recherches, pour tes résultats de recherche. C'est absolument fascinant. Merci beaucoup. And this is all the time we have. I'm going to turn it back now to Alison, to the other Alison Gamble, who's going to take us to the end of this event. Thank you very much.
Principal Fiola, thank you so much for taking the time to host today's lecture. It was lovely to have you here. And Professor Harvey, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presentation was so timely, so thought-provoking. As a parent of teens living the pandemic, I personally appreciate you sharing your work with us, and I know that our community does. So thank you very much, and we wish you well. I'd also like to, at this time, thank and acknowledge the interpretation team who supported today's lecture. They're students in the Masters in Conference Interpretation at Glendon, and their service today is part of the experiential learning that the program offers. Before we say goodbye to you and our audience, we do have a poll question, and it should pop up. How would you rate your knowledge of today's, rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following this insightful discussion? So if you can just take a moment to respond. Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to respond. As mentioned earlier, there will be one more Glendon Scholars Hub Partnership event taking place on March 30th, 2022. It's titled Populism, Legality, and the Politics of Diversity in Canada. Populisme, l'égalité et politique de la diversité au Canada. And our regular Scholars Hub series will return in the new year on January 19th with David Goldstein, who will be discussing one of my favorite topics, eating as an art of connection. For information about these and other events, please visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Finally, here on the alumni engagement team, we're planning for the new year, and we really want your input on topics that you'd be interested in hearing more about as part of the Scholars Hub series in 2022. So we're about to share a link in our chat and would like it if you could take a moment to share your ideas and feedback. Please also feel free to send us suggestions and feedback via our social media channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you and merci. We want to wish you all a safe and happy holiday season. Be well.